And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he answered and said, You shall love the Lord God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But wishing to justify himself, sort of ethical discourse, right? He said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied and said, A certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers. And they stripped him and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. And by chance, a certain priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, who was on a journey, came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion, and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii, and gave them to the innkeeper, and said, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend when I return, I will pay you. Which one of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And he said, The one who showed mercy toward him. And Jesus said to him, Go and do the same. Wuthnow, in his work, Acts of Compassion, found this story to be still a major moral source in American society, but that the modern, when contemplating the story, usually imagines being in the position of the Samaritan, rather than being in the position of the one left half dead. This switch in our moral imagination has profound implications. We imagine ourselves as heroic helpers or omnipotent rescuers, a moral ideal closer to the autonomous, self-asserting modern. I confess that I too would prefer to think of myself as the Good Samaritan, rather than the person on the roadside in need of help. In nursing, we understand this as part of the reason that society can be so forgetful about the primacy of caring for any cure. It is easier for us to be clear about wanting a good doctor when we are ill than imagining that we might ever need a nurse who would perhaps even wash our feet. Needing a nurse conjures up visions of vulnerability, dependency, and suffering that we would rather not think about. The most we can usually admit to is that we want our loved ones to be well cared for. I want to suggest that the starting point in healthcare ethics needs to be in recognition and relationship to the human reality of vulnerability and suffering. The moral vision of compassionate strangers that would meet us in our vulnerability and suffering and respond with compassion is an imperiled but wonderful cultural gift. We live in a pluralistic age where we gather up fragments of many traditions of meeting and relating to the other. Our market and public languages are shaped by the vision of strangers engaging in business transactions without either party having to engage in the lives or traditions of the other. Our legal systems are similarly constructed for justice, adjudicating rights between autonomous strangers. As Shayla Benhabib has pointed out, these are the rights of the general other rather than the particular other. But when we consider suffering and vulnerability and consider how we might promote healthy lives in our families and our communities, we confront particularistic languages of multiple life worlds and particular others. In nursing, we have a lively tradition of caring for and meeting the other in suffering and vulnerability. But this tradition is increasingly challenged in the U.S., where managed care in the form of contracts between third-party payers and employers have created new styles of commodification, and the language of market and economism have become totalizing, even totalitarian. I don't know how we link all forms of capitalism with freedom, but we mistakenly do. And as someone recently said, the blindness of the market is not the same as the blindness of justice. For-profit, the contracts, we've lost notion of the public and the citizen, and the contracts are between the consumers, but who are the consumers? The consumers are the employers buying the insurance rather than the patients who will be using the insurance. For-profit insurance have placed incentives in the healthcare system for decreasing contact with patients and families. This encourages the response of the priest and the Levite. It overlooks the fact that we need incentives for attentiveness and care, and few incentives for avoidance and neglect. We know quite well how to do that on our own. Avoidance and neglect are very real temptations in the face of suffering. We have rhetoric of individual and family responsibility for health without acknowledging suffering and vulnerability and our interdependence. The moral and emotional work of meeting the other and caring for the other in situations of need and vulnerability are hidden in our language often of rights, autonomy, and justice. Now, I quickly say I don't want to do without the language and ethical moorings of justice. We have a lot of remedial work. Justice is designed for remedial work. We have many people outside the gates who cannot get in, and I quite agree. Until we settle that justice issue, let us not talk about the refinements of our middle-class access and privileges. But having said that, justice is remedial and the floor. We still need, I think, care, mercy, generosity, hope, and even love. At the very least, real relationships where the other is met and known are required if we are to avoid the ethical violence of neglect and abuse in the face of vulnerability and suffering. The difficulty family members have watching their loved ones suffer and in assisting them is overlooked as more and more of the burdens of caregiving are shifted to the private sector and the domains of friends and families. You see, this is one of the problems. There are many fallacies about the market and health care as a commodity. I sometimes think we may be in this junk bond era where the for-profit companies are going to spin down to 8 to 10%, hit the reliability issues, and realize there's no more fast, hot growth, and then they may exit. I wonder what will happen when the top is skimmed off of an excessive market. We are in danger of overlooking the role of the compassionate stranger to shore up and support families and friends caring for their loved ones. Even when families do their caring work in the best tradition possible, they too need assistance and support when their loved one is suffering. Beware of all the democratization of caring for yourself and your family members. If you haven't done it lately, it's terribly difficult when you're scared and your world is collapsing and you're feeling vulnerable yourself. I want to try to articulate aspects of the care ethic that I think are given to us in the Judeo-Christian tradition and locate the need for that tradition as a voice from the margin in the current market model of healthcare systems developed for autonomous strangers who meet to sell goods and services, the customer or the consumer models of healthcare. I want to articulate aspects of nursing practice as moral sources for public policy and ethics in healthcare. And here I apologize for not being more ecumenical. I only studied nursing practice. I haven't studied medicine, but I'm sure I would find the same discourses there. And maybe even in law, as we were told at the beginning of the conference. I want to draw on 5 major areas of informal discourses that are really pervasive in the practice, but they operate from the margin and are hidden and are at risk under the new situation. One is knowing the patient, the importance of knowing the patient for understanding, assessing, providing early warnings, following the body's lead, and choosing a life as a basis for technology assessment, reasoning in transition about the particular, which is a socially embedded, agent-centered morality. And here I want to draw in Alistair McIntyre's notion of practice. This is a good time to do this, as professionalism is being so under assault as being only greedy and only self-interested. We need to restore the notion of what it is to have a caring practice to which you are responsible. And I think despite the new social context and the limits of the fiduciary relationship, I think it's a time we have to call it up in a new and vigorous way. And then I'm very concerned about moving all morality away from agent-centered morality, because I think at the coalface it is going to be the agent-centered morality that enters into relationship with patients and provides what we need. And then relationships between ethical and clinical reasoning and making qualitative distinctions in our practice. In other words, this is a call for us to really look at the major rhetoric that is going on about evidence-based medicine, outcomes measurement. Now, I'm not against all of this. I'm just against taking it up as a kind of scientism and a kind of legitimization force that overlooks the requirement in clinical practice that you reason about a particular individual, family, or community over time, taking account the transitions that occur as a part of your understanding. A simple example is that a lab value, of course you need to know the norms, but the norms are relatively less important than the trend that the particular patient shows on those lab values. And so there's a kind of scientism and a kind of brute force legitimization strategy that's going on in the market that's using rational calculation as the sum total of rationality. And I think what we have to do as Christians is open that dialogue up, work on the eclipse of clinical and ethical reasoning, which are always, it should say ethical and clinical reasoning, because your notion of good always is embedded in the clinical decision that you would make. And here I think sometimes, as David Tomasme has called it, the gee whiz ethics has distracted us from some of the more basic elements of meeting the other and the relational ethics that are required in healthcare practice. Okay, that's too much to do, and I probably won't get it all done, but I'll give you a sort of quick hit. From the biblical story of Job, we get a vision of the possibility of arguing with God, pleading for more justice, and we get a really good description of inept helping from Job's comforters. From the Old Testament and the story of the Good Samaritan, in the New Testament, we have developed notions of good about being for the other, standing alongside, standing in for, and giving the other their voice. These are all forms of advocacy that are kin to the theology of the Holy Spirit in the New Testament, the vision of the comforter who stands alongside, who advocates for and substitutes for and meets the other. Last fall, when 70 nursing students handed in their first-person experience narratives about clinical situations that taught them something about practice or stood out in their memory for other reasons, such as mistakes made or lessons learned or examples of the best of their practice, there were about 5 stories, as usual, from neonatal and pediatric intensive care nurses that were about caring for an infant, being the one to know the infant often more intimately than the parents, and therefore being in the position of helping the parents come to know the child. When the infant died, they questioned their care. Was it reasonable for a professional to experience so much pain and so much vulnerability? Invariably, these narratives ask questions about, did they cross professional boundaries of involvement that they should not have crossed? Was it reasonable to expose oneself repeatedly to loss? How could they protect themselves? My answer, and the answer in the class, was that no one could ever demand that they care for an infant to the point of engrossment and suffering over the loss of a child. This can never be mandated by duty. The most we can ask is that the nurse is gentle, attentive, and respectful of the infant and parents from an ethical perspective. We cannot demand that they love these little strangers. It would be a supererogatory demand, something that has no place in the bureaucracy, a demand above the call of duty. And yet, an ethical violence is created if nurses do not ever become engrossed in the infant, to the point that they know the infant in his or her particularity, despite the attendant personal loss that is experienced when the infant dies. In our modern hospitals, there would be no social traces left of the infant if the nurses did not come to know the babies and even love them, and coach the parents in coming to know their infants in this strange biomedical environment. This indeed is a challenging call made by the ethic of care to acknowledge that we cannot, within a rights and justice framework, order, command, or mandate that nurses care for these infants in these ways, and yet a great ethical violence is created if the nurses and physicians do not care, so that neglect instead of responsiveness to the infant occurs. Articulating a social and personal ethic that cannot be mandated or legislated, but the absence of which creates ethical violence, neglect, misrecognition, and abuse, is indeed a challenge in this era of economism, individualism, and commodification of healthcare. We require renewed moral imagination and enchantment with the possibility of loving our neighbor, as illustrated in the story of the Good Samaritan. But as we more clearly can articulate in our psychological age, there are many ways to get our care wrong, as in burnout, codependency, and heroic helping. A Danish theologian whose work has been brought to my attention by Danish and Norwegian nurses, and primarily through the nurse philosopher Kari Martensen, holds up that caring for another is a natural response to the gift of life, of being part of the created universe. And it's here I would challenge the theologians to work harder on that creation theology, work harder on theology of embodiment. We really need those as moral sources and direction at this time. But in his creationist theology, you have to have a reason not to care. You have to have a reason not to experience joy, not to express yourself, not to trust as a response to the gift of life. Mercy, joy, expression, these are sovereign manifestations of being part of a created universe. He is not blind to our rather dark human history, but as a theologian philosopher wants to point out how blind and unnatural it is not to respond with mercy and help to one another who is suffering. I think of that talk by Dr. Brown last night. The physicians had to have a reason to neglect and be inattentive. He states, Lokstrup states, people are bound to one another, among other things, through love, sympathy, and solidarity. By love and friendship, they are bound together in a spontaneous way, whereas in solidarity, they are bound together more through cooperative endeavor and common circumstances. But whether these ties are formed spontaneously or socially, it is these ties which constitute a person's existence. The more intensely and comprehensively a person binds himself to other people spontaneously and socially, the more he will see that a selfish life lived at the expense of others is empty and unsuccessful, and the more he will refrain from that kind of life. As an American, my cultural imagination is colonized by sales, marketing, persuasion, PR, and their attendant cynicism, so that it is difficult for me to think about the pre-ethical, pre-cultural life expressions, such as expressiveness, trust, mercy, joy, that exist like the quaking aspen, the Sierras, but which are manifestations of creation of the human world. When I go to Iceland, Norway, and Finland, I sense that caring practices are taken up differently because they are socially embedded differently in convention and aesthetics. And on this social background, I suspect that the psychology of caring work can be taken up differently. But in either case, a social ethics of care versus a psychological, achievement-oriented, individualistic background of social practices provides different starting points for caring practices. I suspect that there is some incommensurability here that is akin to the stance of using rehabilitation assistive devices in Finland and the US. Finnish nurses showed me devices to keep people independent with such enthusiasm, almost as if each assistive device were a sacred enabler. The nurse would say in an animated way, "This allows the patient to do this, and this one allows that." And I couldn't help but thinking that as an American counterpart would be more likely to say with some pity, "Oh, this device is wherein you can't do this. This helps the poor person who cannot tie his shoes." The North American achievement-oriented competitive social practices and meanings cause us to experience and present assistive devices as equipment that separates the individual from the community of those who can. So we have the can and the cannot. Whereas in the Finnish example, the one who is enabled by the equipment didn't seem to leave the ranks of the social community. Likewise, the public health care agencies looked more like domestic places of dwelling and community and liveliness than institutions. You know, what makes their institutions look so much less institutional than ours? The government makes a statement about the responsibility to every child born in Finland by giving a basic layette. These are strong, public, caring practices that are socially embedded in many ways. These background social understandings of care and public policies of care create a different context than our competitive individualistic rights-based context. Zygmunt Bauman traces our slide from a social policy of a sense of shared responsibility for individual weal and woe. He says, "The welfare state wisely institutionalized commonality of fate. Its provisions were meant for every participant, every citizen." Notice the use of the word citizen instead of consumer here. "In equal measure, thus balancing everybody's privations with everybody's gains. The slow retreat from that principle into the means-tested focused assistance for those who need it has institutionalized the diversity of fate and thus made the unthinkable thinkable. Altogether, different principles are embodied in, say, a child benefit for every parent and a child benefit for the indolent parents alone. The first makes tangible the bond between the public and the private, community and individual, and casts the community as the pledge of the individual's security. The second sets the public and the private against each other and casts the community as the individual's burden and bane. I can imagine that there are problems associated with caring work in Finland, just as there are in the US, but I think that the starting point of discussion is different in a social context where caregiving work is more socially embedded and supported by public programs, discourse, citizen understanding, and policy. In the US, we have elaborate discourses of being victims and heroic helpers. Our novels take up these discourses of surviving whatever failed expectation or being victimized and overcoming victimization. These narratives of victims and heroic overcomers and heroic helpers get lived out in the ways we are and meet with each other. I am leery of ideologies of care that create oppression and feed our self-involvement. I think it is okay to help because it assuages our own sense of helplessness if we start with admitting our own sense of helplessness and vulnerability. But helping the others so that I feel less helpless spawns victims who have to stay victims so that I can be employed as is an aberration and a violence to the care ethic. I am leery of elaborating caring ideology that is more burdensome and enslaving for the lower status group who end up doing the caring. I suspect we also encounter the fear that such ideologies will create expectations that society cannot meet. It is here that some sense of the safety net of the sovereign life expressions could give us a different starting point. An inexhaustible sense of the inherent goodness of life itself as part of a created universe is a radically different but a reasonable starting place. Now, I'm aware of the fall, but sometimes I feel like the Christians forget there was anything before the fall, and I think we need to have our memories jogged. I am sure that secondary gain discourses like "what's in it for me" get us off to the wrong foot, and the stance of affirmation of goodness is good. It tastes good, it feels great to be a good caregiver, a good practitioner, is preferable to a cynical starting place created by rational calculation. Goodness works out because it makes a better society. Any of these sort of secondary explanations for goodness, I think, create a slide that we don't want to begin on. I think we have to face up to the ways that the psychology and pathologies of caring relationships play out differently based on culturally given background social practices. The heroic helper who gains manipulative power over the other through helping, or an unliberated view of the victimized, overburdened helping martyr, or a society that commodifies care at every turn, has reason to be cynical. Bauman, again in his book, Postmodern Ethics, paints a chilling picture. The gentle touch of love, I'm quoting, becomes an iron grip of power. Nothing except the vocabulary, or more exactly, the rhetoric of love and care has survived the transformation. Care for the other, doing it for the sake of the other, doing what is best for the other, and similar love motives are the legitimizing formula of domination. Much of the time, they accompany bureaucratically simplified routines of conscience clearing. We might say people processing, might we? He concludes that the utilitarian recipe for happiness differs from loving care the way that the latest tariff or welfare handouts differs from sharing a meal. In the ascent to the standards of routinized care, love is the first ballast to be thrown overboard. And it is here I want you to join us in nursing in thinking about why is it that the rug is pulled out there first in the market model. It is not Technofix or Technocure that has been assaulted first. Look where the money and the power flows. But the underpinning mere means to keep the Technofix afloat gets assaulted first. And I could just warn you out of self-interest that the Technocure is simply not sustainable without the safety net of vigilance, attentiveness, and care. It all gets very much more hazardous and expensive. We tend to forget what a cultural innovation and gift we have in the Christian tradition of hospitality and the Good Samaritan. My family and I went to Chambon-Lignon, the Huguenot plateau, to pay homage to the tradition of hospitality and respite paid by a Huguenot Christian community who rescued 15,000 Jews during the Nazi persecution, and who continue their hospitality to this very day. This was not an act of ethical heroes and heroines, but an act of a faith community being true to their faith tradition of providing respite for war refugees, inner-city poor children, the persecuted Jews, and more recently, the Bosnian refugees. One neighbor did not know of the neighbor's house guests, and there was an elaborate counterfeiting industry that required infiltration in all aspects of the community with no fear of exposure and disclosure. They had to counterfeit documents of birth, baptism, citizenship, ration cards. To this day, they prefer not to talk about this extraordinary living out of the gospel of loving the neighbor and laying down one's life for the neighbor. If you're interested in this story of Christian hospitality and community of compassionate strangers, you could read about them in Hallie's book, Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed, or in the video tape called Weapons of the Spirit. I raise it as an example of a caring community and an alternative ethical vision to the heroic ethical hero standing against the whole community. Currently, we are designing systems that require us to be ethical heroes and heroines in order to be good at all. And such a system is socially unjust and unsustainable in the end. There is much in our Western healthcare tradition that would give us the vision and opportunity to explore more fully the healing and redempting powers of being in relationship and being for the other. In an era where atomistic individualism and isolation have reached new heights, and when economism and cynicism have invaded every aspect of life, we bear a double responsibility in healthcare ethics, in doctoring and nursing, to help recover the richness of lives of connection and care in our practice and in our society. Practice cannot be completely formalized. Practices can't be completely formalized because of their complex social, practical, local, and historical basis. A caring practice requires action and reasoning in transition with the particular patient, family, and community. This is essentially ethical and clinical reasoning. And we've had an eclipse of ethical clinical reasoning with a kind of scientism of just looking at aggregate statistics. We have the Apache 3 in the intensive care unit that is a prognostic scoring system. Well, I'm not against that rational calculation device as a benchmark and a point of reference. I am against it as a supplanting of clinical and ethical reasoning about the particular patient in the particular situation. And I'm more disturbed about the sort of covering over of clinical judgment of the rhetoric of aggregate statistics and means ends analysis accrue. We need to really recover the essential nature of reasoning over time about the particular, the kind of gains in understanding or loss in understanding. In practice, we call it chasing a problem or being on top of it or understanding or having a good grasp. And that takes relationship and keeping track of what's going on. It's one of the threats of the fragmentation, de-skilling, and multi-skilling that's going on that undermine the practice. And we have to, I think, as non-rational as it may sound, I think it is far more rational to imagine a fiduciary relationship with practitioners of good training and good character in order to create the redesign. We have all the rhetoric of redesign, but it's something that didn't work well in the car industry. I don't know why we think it's going to work so well in healthcare, because it takes away the design ability of those closest to the problems. But of course, the people closest to the problem have to have the vision of designing for more reliability and more efficiency. We have a kind of tyranny of accountants right now that are taking about 35 cents on the dollar, along with the managers that are making so very much money. But we have to have a critique of the accounting, because the accountants don't really know what counts. They're counting very episodic periods of care. What gets buried are the ambulance trips that the family's paying for because their family member's not able to get to the hospital in a car in the outpatient department. They're not really counting the longer term, and they're not counting in the outcome studies the differential impact on different patient populations. So what we have to do, I think, is be very critical and very scholarly about our understanding of the limits of rational calculation. And here is Descartes' legacy that we need to unpack a little bit and rethink, because he narrowed our vision of rationality down to means ends analysis and rational calculation, as in cost-benefit ratios. We have to say, no, there's a larger rationality that looks at larger pieces, and that flat criterial reasoning is a snapshot kind of judgment that works well in scientific experiments and even works for large aggregate studies. But you have to have also the legitimacy of reasoning in transition about particular local communities, patients, in order to have true rationality. And also to value the non-rational. Now, by non-rational, I don't mean irrational, but caring is frankly non-rational. And how do we value the non-rational in this absolute sweep of rational calculation for rationalization? So being in relationship to the particular person's situations cannot be replaced by scientific evaluative strategies of disengaged criterial reasoning. Nevertheless, those engaging in a practice can recognize strong instances of excellent or poor practice. This is the other device that has come in to say, well, there is a lot of ignorance about good and poor practice, and I don't mind the benchmarking spine to compare and the scrutiny. We needed it, and we need it still. But what I am concerned about is replacing a broader vision of rationality and judgment with mere means ends analysis, in which the means gets very much separated from the ends. And as a nurse, you can see that I really wouldn't want that to happen. As Charles Taylor points out, the necessary conditions for this creation of separate, unique, autonomous individuals are caring practices, recognition practices that the private, self-constituted individual must cover over or deny in order to claim inner, unique, uninfluenced sources of identity. Caring practices that spawn these free individuals tend to highlight the person's independence and render all but invisible the webs of connection and care that make the separate, free individual myth or illusion possible. Being in relationship, feeling dependent on another, makes the individual who seeks unrealistic levels of control and autonomy feel vulnerable or like a failure. Extreme individualism and a disillusioned utilitarian view of the insular autonomous self undermine a sense of connectedness, community, and caring practice in all spheres, both public and private. If caring practices are to be sustained, the nature and content of those practices must be uncovered, and the social, political conditions, institutional structures, and environment that foster caring practices will have to be worked out in a public discourse along with the strategies for nurturing them. I want to just give maybe examples of practice-based understandings and notions of good that can resist the violence of a technological and commodified self-understanding, or even a technological imperative, while fully embracing the possibilities offered by technology. To be not blinded by either the possibilities or abuses of technologies takes clinical and ethical discernment in particular relationships and situations. I found 3 informal ethical discourses in nurses that nurses use in their everyday practice to make wise and practical decisions about the good and the harm of technology. The patient advocacy discourse is one of the very large ones, and I have found it in many practical examples to point to multiple meanings nurses have for advocacy. There are at least 6 distinct meanings, and we've presented this in the book Crisis of Care. Advocacy means all the myriad ways that one can be for the other, stand alongside, give the other his or her voice, speak for the other, make sure the medical and nursing treatments are coordinated and in line with the patient's family's understanding. This is a broad understanding of advocacies that theologians will recognize as being close to the work of the Holy Spirit. Also, the informal discourse about knowing a patient. Knowing a patient is prior to assessing a patient. Here, life, world, and system meet. Knowing the patient is the basis for understanding the patient's family's responses and needs. Many harmful mistakes are avoided, and subtle cues are noticed by knowing the patient. Knowing the patient allows the nurses to follow the body's lead. Now, I have been stunned in working and doing observation and research in recovery room and one-day surgery of how the conveyor line mentality is cutting short the pre-patient interview. Well, it's in those pre-patient interviews that many lives are saved about allergies, which limb to be operated on, and really basic stuff. It's really hazard to do the sort of high-tech cures if we do not know the patient. And we are blind, I think, to the care network that renders these techniques safe. I'm going to skip over a bit here. I want to, the notion of following the body's lead and also offering comfort measures in relation to the use of technology is an ethical discourse about not usurping the powers of the body to recover, and not by using technology longer than it needs to be used, and not disrupting the rhythms. For example, the premature infant will only tolerate so much feeding. Well, one needs to know the infant. One can't put the rigid schedule or the number of ounces down. These all require attentiveness and knowing the patient. Now, this is a very different structure of practice than part tasking out the jobs where attentiveness falls short and the ability to know the patient is lost. Coaching patients and family members to stand up for quality of life and setting limits to technology use are also common stances for nurses in relation to patients facing death. Supi Wong gives an example of seeing a patient seeing a nurse help a mother and infant who had the infant had 1 year or less life expectancy at birth. She was inspired and taught by a more senior nurse's wise instruction to the patient to choose life for her baby. Jim, the nurse, reminisced about the mother and infant. This is Su Ping Wang's words here. The child had a short gut syndrome. He said, "I remember how hopeless and powerless Lynn, the mother, seemed. Doctors came in and out and performed tests and procedures on Sammy. I asked her how she was doing. She said, 'I barely see him. We spend more time at the hospital than at home. I don't know what to do. I know that he's not getting better.' Jim, the nurse, responded to Lynn, 'Look, you know that Sammy is going to die. Of course bring him in when he's ill, but set a limit. Don't let the doctors keep bugging him with procedures and protocols. Let Sammy be your child and build a bond of love. Let him feel the comforts of you instead of medical intervention from foreign hands. If the doctors can't stabilize his symptoms in a week, just take him home and care for him at home. Sammy is a baby that needs what a baby needs, his parents. Medical intervention may make him live an extra month or two, but the extra months are of poor quality. I just feel that if a child is known to be terminal, parents should try to build memories of their child at home in their arms with family members, celebrating holidays and so forth. Just as old people on their deathbed will never say, 'Geez, I wish I'd spent more time at the office.' The day a terminally ill baby dies, the parent usually doesn't say, 'Oh, I wish I'd spent more time in the hospital.'" The mother then explained to the nurse, who was learning from Jim about creating a life for a terminally ill baby. I said to the mother, Lynn, "It must be hard to see him so ill." Lynn smiled and said, "Yes, but he's doing all right. 6 months ago, the doctors didn't expect him to live for 3 months. Now he's 9 months old. He just needs to live as much as he can, not as long as he can. Time is already too short. I want to make time count, not pass in vain. It's not that I'm giving up hope for my child, but I don't want to keep interrupting his life." See the ethical, moral space of life here? Jim's message was not just that my baby was going to die. When I listened carefully, his message was really, let Sammy live what he has left. I am so thankful that he told me. I finally feel like a mother providing care and not a powerless bystander. Maybe Sammy won't live to the longest time possible, but he's doing darn well, and I think he's much happier. Knowing the patient, following the body's lead, and honoring life are all resistance discourses that push back the technological imperative and the totalizing discourse of normalizing of diagnosis, of finding how far short someone falls from an ideal or a norm. Now, what I have in mind here is that we really need, both in medicine and nursing, to do some critical new thinking about the slide toward technicure that has colonized medicine. And we need to acknowledge in this very unstable, chaotic time that many of the things, right now our system is so medicalized, and things show up only after pronounced disease has occurred, usually in 3 systems. And what we need to do is to push back our understanding of care. And we need to, it's interesting, in Germany, not noted for its social enlightenment, has just instituted a social category for receiving care. We desperately need social categories to be enlarged for care, because it is the breakdown of care in the home and in the community that are the prodromal time of disease manifestation. And because we've been so colonized by technofix and technocure, we haven't looked at the earlier, lower technical, but attentiveness requiring care that prevents disease and illness. I worry about this lot in the market model because there is rhetoric about preventive care. Even preventive care is usually thought of as very technical kinds of interventions like immunization. But we need to shore up the communities of care, the families of care, the attentiveness in the community. And if we did this, we would stop much of the disease and certainly much of the late arrival. I agree with Dr. Wheeler. We first have to figure out a way to be a much more just society. But justice will not be enough. And I think as Christians we need to figure out anew how to be salt and light, how to honor the fiduciary relationship with patients, and how to revisit the wonderful moral vision of the Good Samaritan. Thank you.